Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us online for today's Dalit Feminist-led celebration and discussion of Thenmozhi Soundararajan's anticipated new book, The Trauma of Caste, A Dalit Feminist Meditation on Survivorship, Healing, and Abolition. My name is Vandana Pawa. I'm the programs coordinator at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. A quick visual description of me: I have dark hair, round black-rimmed glasses, and I'm wearing a dark blue long sleeve sweater. This event is taking place across multiple time zones, so please do say hi and let us know in the chat where you're watching us from. I'm speaking to you today from Brooklyn, New York, where I am on ancestral and unceded Canarsie and Munsee Lenape land. We acknowledge the custodians of this land we're on today and pay our respects to their elders. For those of you who are new to the Asian American Writers Workshop, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian and Pacific diasporic literature and storytelling. We hold frequent readings and conversations like this one, organize community arts programming in New York City high schools and senior centers, run fellowship programs for emerging writers of color, and publish an online award-winning literary magazine called The Margins. You can find out more by visiting us at AAWW.org or following us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. I also want to make sure that I note that you can purchase copies of The Trauma of Caste via a link that I will be sharing in the chat, and we very much hope that you do so. During this event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, casteist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and that person will be removed from this event. We'll open our event with a conversation on the book with Thenmozhi and our moderator, Dhanya Addanki, followed by a panel conversation with Thenmozhi, Pabitra Dash, John Boopalan, and Mimi Mondal. We will then have time for audience Q&A, so please submit your questions by the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll briefly introduce Thenmozhi and Dhanya, and then I hope you will join me in welcoming them on screen. Thenmozhi is a Dalit American artist, community organizer, technologist, and theorist. Currently, she is the executive director of Equality Labs, which she co-founded. Equality Labs is the largest Dalit civil rights organization working to empower caste-oppressed people in the US and globally. Through her work at Equality Labs, Thenmozhi has mobilized South Asian Americans towards dismantling eons-long systems of oppression with the goal of ending caste apartheid, gender-based violence, white supremacy, and religious intolerance. Thenmozhi previously co-founded Third World Majority, an international media training organization and collective that supported people from disenfranchised groups in telling their own stories in their own way. Thenmozhi's intersectional, cross-pollinating work, research, education, art, activism, and digital security helps to create a more generous, global, expansive, and inclusive definition of the South Asian identity, along with safe spaces from which to honor the stories of those communities. Dhanya Addanki is a journalist, editor, and oral historian. Her work concentrates on human rights, religion, and political journalism. She was born in South India and raised in South Texas. So please join me in welcoming on screen Dhanya and Thenmozhi.
Jai Savrati, so nice to be here with you, Dhanya.
Hi, Thenmozhi. How are you? Thank you so much, Vandana, for that introduction. I am so excited to be here, and I am so thrilled to be talking to you, Thenmozhi, and just feel very honored to be in your presence talking about this very historic book that you've written. I think before I get to the book a little bit, I know Vandana named a few of your accomplishments. You've been at the forefront of so many Dalit civil rights struggles. You founded not only Equality Labs, but co-founded Dalit History Month, and were in the middle of so many radical movements and started so many radical collectives. And in the process of all of that, your life was threatened. You had to go into hiding. You were called every name in the book, and there were so many threats to your life. And instead of writing a book called What in the Fresh Hell Is This World? Or What is Wrong with Humanity? You chose to write a book instead about meditation, survivorship, healing, and abolition. Why did you focus on writing about healing and meditation when there were so many other things that you could have written about?
Wow, right off the gate, right, Dhanya?
Right after that, let's go.
Well, I think that, our people have really endured tremendous violence for centuries, and it's in our bodies, it's in our minds, it's in our spirits, it's in the societal structures that we navigate. And, I think we know how to fight. I think we know how to be the soldiers for other people and for ourselves. But I think we rarely give ourselves permission to heal. And it's a very radical, it's actually pretty shocking when you think about how little Dalit people get to center their own healing in any part of their life. That you see how much of a radical proposition it actually is, because everything changes when Dalit people are embodied. When we are given permission to grieve the violence that we endure, when we are given when we take back the right to create space and time for our hearts that are broken to have time to mend, and for us to tend our wounds that are a result of this, everything transforms, because we have to slow all of the rest of the systems of exploitation in order for us to be present. And, I really came to this like after the pandemic, during the pandemic, just like with everybody else, I was stuck at home, and we started 2019 with the genocide in India and the opening of that terrible project, and then we went right to the pandemic, and then of course the terribleness of the uprising and a coup, all of this happening in less than like 18 months, right? And for me, there was also a personal apocalypse where my mom fell ill. And I think when you watch someone fight for their life, it changes the stakes. It's not enough to have a clapback win. And if you notice with their battles around caste, it's like we get one piece of the assertion, and then the bigots immediately push us back. It's why Dr. Ambedkar talked about the history of the subcontinent is that of revolution and counter-revolution. And it's an endless cycle of atrocity healing and then atrocity again, because we never fully address what's happening. And so I think I tried to work within myself to think about what could change, if we approach this problem differently. And, I think we have a lot of books that talk about the political economic project of caste, but none that really talk about the trauma and the psychosocial impacts. And this is an area where I think a lot of Black and Brown and Indigenous social workers and therapists and spiritual workers have really said, look, whenever you have a big system of exclusion, whether it's racism or settler colonialism, and communities have survived things like genocide or enslavement, there is a way that trauma is not just about what happens between individuals, but it's about systems on people, and they stay across generations in communities. And Eduardo Duran called this the soul wound. And for Indigenous people, it's the soul wound that comes from, genocide. But what's our soul wound as caste oppressed people and as South Asian people? We never have a term to even address that lineage of violence that we carry, and that all South Asians carry. It's not just the caste oppressed, the caste privilege also have a way that they carry this as well. And so I think that, slowing down enough to think about what was happening in terms of our cycles of violence in the South Asian community, and trying to have new tools to look at this both from an intergenerational lens and to open up pathways for us to heal so that we can really let this go and no other generation has to carry this burden. That's why I wrote this book. And that's why I called it The Trauma of Caste, because it's a trauma, and even to say that is to acknowledge the dehumanization that caste oppressed people have undergone, and that caste privileged people also dehumanize themselves when they've allowed crimes of caste to happen in their name.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading your book, it is partly your life story as well, right? So how many years in the making was this book? When did you first think about writing a book even? Just, I would love to hear some of that process from you.
I did not really think about this book until I started writing it, which was it's not like it was there in the shadows. I mean, like everybody, I'm sure I wanted to write a book, but I never really had time to do so. But I think when my mom fell sick, there was like it was almost like a holy energy, a fire, where it was like, I want her to see this book before she passes. And so I think that allowed me to just kind of push everything away in order to write. And, I woke up at 3 a.m. I would write from like 3 to 7 before work started. And, it was a really incredibly difficult and challenging thing to get done. But I also felt as I was writing it, my ancestors were writing it with me, because there was things that I channeled and truths that I felt were truths that weren't just my truth. It was our people's truth. And I think, again, like when you are starting to lose a parent, and in a larger way, we're in a process of losing the earth as we've known it. There's tremendous grief that we face as a species right now. And there's ways that we can disassociate from it and walk away from it, or there are ways where we can ground into this moment, into this volatility, and take the lessons we need to know in order to be able to heal. And that's what's really brought me to this table. And it was a very humbling process, because I have no like dreams of like, hey, I'm this like person that can write a fancy pants book. I actually had to really struggle with my own PTSD that came from police brutality. And so my writing process is a very unusual one, where I like record myself saying certain things and then craft the text from that. And it was a journey, in many different ways. But I do think that we need more and more Dalits to write books and speak our stories right now, because the direction of South Asia has to be driven by those who are on the margins. And we know what happens with dominant caste people frame our histories and are the architects of our future. It ends in genocide. So now the path is really on us to make the pivot, and we can make the pivot collectively, but we need to be able to surrender to the truths that are our truths at this very brutal moment.
Yeah, I think when I think about Dalit history, when I think about history of ancestors, and all of the things that our communities have been through, you are one of the first people that I go to if I have any questions. You have so much knowledge and so much experience about our ancestors, and even currently what's happening. And I'm wondering, as you were writing this book, was there one or two things that you found out about Dalit communities, about yourself, about your family, that was new or shocking to you?
I think, probably the thing that was most shocking for me was how disembodied I was from our reality as Dalit people. And I say that because I think many of us, and we have really powerful people that will be speaking in response to the book, we all know how to intellectualize the conversation about caste. We know the data. We know where to drive people if they need to get reports. And as someone who's been an advocate around this issue, like I can speak to anyone around the world in any position of power and give a very strong testimony as to like what we need to do to address caste equity. That said, I think it took writing this book for me to be able to slow down enough to know how much grief I had about the conditions of our community and my family, where that grief lived, and how long that grief had held me back from being a full and integrated person. And in big ways and small, like one of the things I was, very much able to say after I wrote the book is that one of the truths of what it is to be a Dalit is that you are a survivor of religious abuse. And I don't think I could say that. I don't think that idea was crystallized enough for me until after I finished the book. I always knew I was a seeker. I also was such an unusual child because, like, when I was 5, I had 2 games I played. Like, I played like I was a nun, like I was like on a mountain trying to get into spiritual things, and I played that I was in jail. What a weird 2 games for a child to play, but they're so true when you think about what it is to be an untouchable, right? Or to be a Dalit. But I think that being a seeker meant I was always trying to find a spiritual home. And I read like all of the religious texts by the time I was in high school. And I was hungry for a place to know where I belonged in the existential universe. And I think every time I tried to find a home, I faced that ultimate kind of way that Dalits are shunned in different traditions. I felt that. And I think it's a testament to my resilience and to many Dalits' resilience that just because one faith or one cultural practice, pushes us out, we still yearn to find community and create practices that are on our own terms. And I think I had to kind of observe the arc of my life and also read deeply these texts and the cultural practices where we've been shunned, to read them not just as like a logical linear text, but actually with an embodiment experience. Because I think when I read them as a child, I felt shock, but I didn't even know how to have words for it. Like when they equate the womb of a Dalit person, a Dalit woman, to that of a jackal or a wild animal, or the ways that they talk about the different punishments, like in the Mulaki Ain, the document in Nepal, and there's different gradations of, survivors of violence based on your caste for despicable sexual acts and other things. To recognize my embodied reaction to it was to actually also be able to speak how deeply the religious abuse was. So those were things that really, I think, became manifest for me as I write it. And it's something I think that I really just want to share with so many of the Dalits that are online, or for other writers from oppressed communities. Oftentimes when you are kind of born into an oppressed identity, you're constantly fighting fires. You're a crisis, responder. And I think when you go from firefight to firefight, you never get a chance to slow down and look up at the stars and say, what on earth has happened to me? And even more, you don't get to be an architect of your future because you're always in the disastrous present. And so I think for me, this book was not just, a collection of trying to bring my consciousness back together again after violence, but also to help chart a path for healing and for Dalit feminist futures, where we might be able to find new openings to our context as South Asians, that are driven by caste oppressed people, not by the dominator systems that have dehumanized all of us.
Yeah. I love that you talk about being a seeker. I know you say that in your book too. You say you have to be aggressive about being a seeker, and you can't dismantle what you can't see, right? And what was so striking to me as I was reading through your book was your story when you were in Berkeley at 19 years old. You checked out this book, which featured a collection of newspapers that recounted atrocities against Dalit folks over a 10-year period. And I think what struck me the most was you said that every time you go back to Berkeley, you'll go and see if anybody has checked that book out. And it's only been you. You're the only person to ever have checked that book out. And as I was reading that, I was imagining you as a 19-year-old in a library, just witnessing all of this pain and witnessing that there are no names in this book. It's just atrocity after atrocity. Yeah, and it brought me to tears just thinking about you in the library as a 19-year-old kid, being the only witness to all of this in that context. And the other thing is, to me, it spoke to me a lot about the isolation of Dalit people, and the lack of knowledge in general in society about this 2,000-year-old apartheid practice. And you also said that professors at Berkeley actually hindered your discovery of caste, your discovery of your own caste, your discovery of your own self, because they were afraid that you might free yourself. I think that entire page of your book was one of the most profound things that I've ever read. And I'm wondering, despite all of that, how did you free yourself, and what does freeing ourselves look like?
I mean, I think that the permission for us to be humanized and to be human is such a beautiful gift that we can give to ourselves. And it means big things and small things. You know, one, I think the pace of Brahmanism, you know, the animating system that, you know, set up the caste system, and white supremacy and capitalism are such that they want us to move at their pace of domination. And that doesn't let us to slow down enough to actually understand what is being taken away from us. And, you know, I think that as Dalit Americans, and Dalit Americans are made up of people who are recently migrated here from their homelands and children of those migrants. And I'm in that latter, just like you, I'm a second generation Dalit American. And I think for us, we witness the trauma of caste in our families' bodies and in the way our families interact with other communities. And so even before I had words, even before my mom had the talk with me about being Dalit, I could see my parents were very, very traumatized about whatever they had gone through. I didn't have words for it because I was a child, but I was watching how terrified they were about everything. And that's what made me curious, because I was like, here are the strongest, most amazing people in the world. Why are they having nightmares? Why are they not saying certain things to parents, to other parents, which I know they would normally say just in our home? And the weirdest thing, you know, and I wrote about this, and it's still like one of my most vivid memories, because I was raised both Hindu and Christian, was that my mom was terrified of us being found out to be Christian, because, you know, Christians are a caste oppressed faith, and most people that are Christians are people who are converted to Christianity from Hinduism. And my mom literally put Jesus and her Christian practice in the closet. It was literally in a closet. And even though we were in a suburb, none of our neighbors were Indian, she was so worried. So when she would go to pray, she would close the blinds, she would shush us and close the door, then open up the closet, light the candles, pull out the prayer book, and then we'd pray in Tamil. And then we were done, we had to shut it, close it, and then never speak about it. It was so weird to me, you know, because I would see other people and you'd go to their houses and they could pray to whoever they wanted. I was like, Mom, why are we doing this? This is stupid. And she was like, no, don't say anything. And she wouldn't explain why. It was just like, no. Same thing with why my dad didn't speak about his background to other uncles at the temple. It was just like a line we didn't cross. But, you know, with young Dalit women, we don't really take no for an answer. So that was the part where I just kept investigating and sleuthing. And that's what brought me to the studies at school. And again, I think this is the problem about being gaslit as a people, is that no one just acknowledges this is happening. Everyone just keeps playing a sleight of hand with the death and the misery and the exploitation that our people are going through. They're like, you're not really going through it. That doesn't exist. Don't do that. But if we actually follow what they say, there's this tremendous wound that is growing and growing and growing for our people. And we're the only ones that are carrying that burden. And I think that burden is what really drives our community with all these psychosocial problems. You know, it's not like we're more predestined to have suicidal ideation or depression. It's that we're carrying the tremendous burden of this violent system. And I think that I really saw that we needed to have a different path. And so for me, freedom was about being able to live my life unapologetically. And so I came out as Dalit, when I was 18 or 19. And at that time, there was very little Dalits that were out. So it was really fucking hard. And I faced a lot of problems. But I also saw the beginnings of community, and slowly, especially once we started to do, work related to caste-based sexual violence. And I was really lucky to work with AAWW and the women of Dalit Women Fight to do the first tour to break the silence about caste-based sexual violence. that was this watershed moment where the diaspora finally could not ignore this. And it was kind of a runaway train after that, because from there we went to doing the caste survey. We had the California textbook struggle. And once that data was there, it was like we finally established the landmark. And I think more and more Dalits have come out ever since. So for me, freedom is like practical and economic and political. Like we want Dalits to have safe workplaces. We don't want the physical violence that we're seeing. We don't want the gaslighting. We want our homelands to be safe. We don't want genocide. And I also think we want the right to be able to be whoever the fuck we want, whoever we want to love, whoever we want to be whatever gender we want. We just want people to stop fucking taking over our bodies and minds and spaces, because Brahmanism works by removing consent in all domains. So when we return consent, we actually are annihilating caste in so many profound ways. I don't think South Asians have ever lived in a healthy relationship to consent because of how much control of the reproductive function of all genders is required under Brahminical patriarchy. So it's not like we have a choice to not live our lives freely. This is actually how we break Brahmanism, you know?
Amen. We're going to start opening up to the next panelist, but I do want to ask one question before we do that. Did your mom look at the book? Was she able to read through it? What was that experience like?
Okay, so for anyone that's an author, it's always really embarrassing and nerve-wracking to have your parents read your work. And both of my parents read the book very differently. So my dad read the book in quiet, and then he came back and he's like, wow, I can't believe you did that. And he's like, how did you have so many footnotes? How did you read so many books to do this? And I think in his mind, the project of writing in English and writing in so many different contexts was really powerful for him. And I also think the other thing that was really impactful for him was to hear all the different stories across South Asia and the different ancestors, because even though he's 80 years old, even though he grew up like under very punishing discrimination and exclusion, he had been miseducated and has been spending his like last couple of years learning. So for him, and watching him use that text in that way was so rewarding. And with my mom, she like basically I read it to her at night. You know, I read like probably 10 pages every night, and it's a very intimate and really such a loving way to tell her the story of our lives together. And there's things that, you know, I think as Dalits, we don't value our lives, you know. So I would always think like, oh, Savarna lives look important. They have those big things going on. What are our lives doing? You know, but actually we have such beautiful moments of repair and connection and healing that our parents are trying to make meaning out of very difficult things. So even small things like how I described the talk, you know, she was like, I don't even remember that. She's like, how did you as a little baby have a remembrance of this, you know? So it's a way where I'm telling her story back in a way where I've given it an anchor of love. And I think that is so tender, because very few people have ever treated my parents with the dignity that they deserve in terms of their experiences that they've lived. So to me, it was really touching, embarrassing, and also just one of the best things I could have ever done, because I know that before they go, they'll know that they were seen and with like deep love. And that empathetic witness is deeply, deeply healing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, T. I would love to open up the conversation to our fellow panelists who are currently here. If you want to start turning your videos on, I'm going to read little bios for everybody. First, we have Pabitra Dash, who is an organizer and activist from Nepal and a senior organizer at Adhikar, where she leads the leadership development of hundreds of workers through nail salon organizing in New York City. We also have Dr. Soundararajan Boopalan, an assistant professor of biblical and theological studies at Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg, Canada, and the author of Memory, Grief, and Agency, His most recent essay, Religion and the Production of Effect in Caste-Based Society, is part of an edited book titled Global Visions of Violence, published by Rutgers University Press. And we also have Mimi Mondal, a celebrated science fiction author and editor. Her latest publication is the Dungeons and Dragons adventure in the Mists of Manivarsha, and the anthology Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel. In 2020, her novelette, His Footsteps Through Darkness and Light, was nominated for a Nebula Award, and she was also shortlisted for the Hugo Award. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I would love to start out with Pabitra, just as a reflection on the conversation that you heard between me and Thenmozhi, and also your thoughts about the book as well. Just opening up the conversation to you first.
Thank you, Dhanya. Namaste, good evening. My name is Pabitra Dash. Currently, I'm working at Adhikar. I'm not going to deepen and talk about Adhikar work today, but I'm always thankful to the Adhikar team and amazing work on different issues. Today, I stand by myself for Dalit issues and community. I'd like to say huge congratulations to Thenmozhi for this book. I'm happy to celebrate together. I'm thankful and grateful to part of this family today. When I start to read, actually, to be honest, the Trauma of Caste is emotional, and I feel like right away I want to stop reading. But my inner heart says, need to read this book to stand for my Dalit community. And while I'm reading this book, actually, it gives me so much reflection about my own story. It reminds me that I was like 5 years old, and my grandmother wants to send me at school, and I had to sit separately from the so-called high caste in the classroom. One day, unknowingly, one of my friends, she tossed me, and she started to cry. And she told to the teacher, like, oh, Pabitra she tossed me today. And my teacher was very angry. And as a Dalit, that's not acceptance in my schools. Like my teacher, she's very angry, and then she started to beating me. And I don't know, the age of 5, beaten from teacher. And I just remember that, like, I was in a bed for a month, and totally I want is a bed rest. That is my childhood education. It started with my bad experience. And, you know, it's hard to say, but I never ever wants to go back again to school. My grandmom is start to fighting for a teacher. She want to send me same school, but I don't have inner power to go again because I was only 5 years old. And my parents, they tried to send me another schools, which is 1.5 hours from my home. There's no transportation. Age of early age, like 5 years, I have to walk 1.5 hours to reach schools. Yeah, that's the experience it's recalled me while I read this book. That's the reason, actually, if I reflect that, like, I want to protect my community. So that's the reason I start my social work when I was 11 years old. Being a Dalit, abuse, harassment, scare, hiding our identity, dominant is very common for my community. Forget about Nepali story now. I'm gonna say something about the United States. Be strong, Pabitra. So when I migrated from Nepal, my imagination and my dreams was totally different. And being in the United States, I feel like, oh, this is a human rights country and freedom from rights. As soon as I started to work for the nail industry, I had a really bad experience. The way my coworkers behave for Black communities, clients is not acceptable for me. They use very bad word for our Black communities clients. But I am very surprised because while they use bad word for the Black community clients is used to use for Dalit community in Nepal. And it's so hard for me to digest those kind of bad words for the community. And I started to tell my coworkers, if you repeated this bad word again and again, I will call police. From that incident, I made very strong connection with Black community. Even though Black communities issues and Dalit communities issues are different, but I don't know why I make so much connection with Black communities. And yeah, I think about their struggle in here as well. And I related that struggle for our our Dalit communities as well. And I'm very surprised for one thing is, in my observation, here too in the United States, if some girls or some family members, they want to marry with white guy, it's really acceptance for all family. They are happily welcome for everyone. I'm not blaming. I'm just blaming for the society and our mentality. Okay, don't think like, oh, I'm gonna say some wrong, but that's my observation. And if there's the Black guy and then Dalit communities members, people gonna use bad word. Oh, this is Dalit, this is Black, this girl is went for marriage. Isn't it so frustrating? But while I read this book, I remember, while I read Thenmozhi book, actually, these all things is recalled in my mind, and then I'm thinking more deeper. Nothing else.
Thank you so much for sharing, Pabitra.
Yeah, and actually at Adhikar, I met my mentor, Pabitra Benjamin. Unfortunately, I'm very sad because he transitioned from Adhikar recently, few months ago, like last month. She and I came from a Dalit community, same community, and I was so happy to talk with her about our own issues. She shared a story about her mother, Sita Khati, for whom I know from Nepal. She's a really good supporter for Dalit community from United States to Nepal. But her mother did not want to tell about her own communities and stories to her children. And my friend, Pabitra Khati Benjamin, I like to say friend, she's 81. She told me like, my mom always wants to hide that. She never ever wants to, share that story because my mom is really worried about we are going to be discriminated by our society and community. That's why she wanna hide those things, and she doesn't wanna, share this experience to us. So our modern and intelligent society make rumor. The Dalit members does not want to talk about their issues in the United States. Our members are struggling to get room, cannot get roommate, and not easy access to get a room. That's why our members hide identity. Don't make it rumor. Do you ask how they are survived? No. So don't make rumor for that. If the roommate knows about caste, they start to create drama. Oh, my family is visiting me. Please make my room empty. What a smart way. My home is post office for Dalit community. Our all Dalit members are, so scared, and they want to hide their identity because they want to easy access and survive in the United States. We don't want to treat equally like Nepal and United States, and we have different role here to survive as well. That's why I have to work for extra as a post office to share that later. There are all of the things like to my communities to make them safe. Nothing else I have to do to save and to hide our identity. We are trying to talk about this kind of issues because the country is changing and we have our own struggle. We are tired to talk. We did these things in Nepal, and why we have to do it in here as well. But while I read Thenmozhi's book, I feel like, oh yeah, as we migrant here, but we bring so many things together, and our condition and our issues are same from Nepal to United States. To create discrimination, and discrimination is equally which we face in Nepal, and here is similar. Actually, one interesting thing I really like to share is, in one meeting I went for, and I met one American born priest who had a degree in Sanskrit and Hinduism, he presented that we need Dalit and oppressed to maintain our ecosystem. Our modern priests have more idea to create discrimination for Dalit and to keep ecosystem. I don't understand why he tried to present that. As a human being, I feel very harassed from that. He tried to say that, like, if there is no Dalit and there is no oppressed, how come we can manage this ecosystem? So who teach him that? I'm very surprised. And modern people, they try to treat and discriminate in a different way. The way he talked about it, almost like the organizer keep trying to him say, like, stop, but he doesn't want to stop. And then at the end, they're threatening like, oh, okay, we're gonna call police, and then he left. That I experienced in New York.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing, Pabitra. You're doing such incredible work. And I'm so glad that you're able to join us in the conversation. I would love to open up the floor to John, if you would like to respond to the conversation and to talk a little bit more about Thenmozhi's book.
Hey, wow. Thanks, you all. Thanks, Dhanya Thenmozhi, for starting the conversation off. My name is John, and some identifying markers here are I wear glasses. I have a bookshelf behind me. I'm wearing a gray long sleeve sweater. Yeah, that's a little bit about me if you need to mark that. That's helpful. Thanks, Dhanya Thenmozhi, for starting the conversation off. That was a great conversation. I felt like you could have gone on for a few more minutes, right? Time just flies that way. Thanks, Pabitra, for your story as well. Let me, I don't know, I feel like these days most of my responses are, I have to set the time here so that I don't go over time. It's just, I just want to respond to folks, it's just like, I don't know, I feel like there's nothing new to say. It's really the conversation is such that you just keeping on, right? You just keep the conversation alive. So some of the things that I want to respond to, I'll get to that. But formally, let me also thank Asian Americans Writers Workshop for hosting, for you, Dhanya, for moderating, and all of you to be in conversation here. It's so great. I teach at the Canadian Mennonite University, which is a really cool, small university in the city of Winnipeg in Canada. If for those of you who don't know Mennonite in Canadian Mennonite University, maybe I should say one thing as an intro into what I want to say today is Mennonites are Christian pacifists, which means that here are Christian communities that actually said no to war. So when nation states went to war, right, Mennonites said, we don't do war. We are pacifists. So Mennonites actually actively resisted nation states' war machinery, right? Because they did not allow themselves to be recruited by nation states to be soldiers in war. They said no to that. So it's a very pretty significant Christian community, I think, because of that reason. And the reason I start with that is, I think my 2 cents on that kind of Mennonite reaction to violence is they saw the bullshit of violence, I think. And they said no to that bullshit. And I think the task before us is actually the task of saying no to bullshit. So I want to thank you, Thenmozhi, for writing the book, right? For adding your contribution to talk globally about caste, right? I think this book is important in that way because it allows us to talk globally about caste. For those of us who know how caste works and the violent ways in which it operates, we know the story, right? And for caste to have this kind of global discussion, I think is just hugely, hugely important, because I think what it asks for is kind of a collective no to bullshit, right? Like I often say to my interlocutors here in the North American context, like, is anybody really white? I mean, is anybody really white? Nobody's really white, right? I mean, this tube light above my head is white, right? And yet we say these things about ourselves, like, I'm white. or in the Indian context, we say we are, I don't know, we are the top of the food chain because we came from God's head or arms or thighs or feet. Like that's some of the worst bullshit, right? I mean, like, what bullshit is that? Like, wow, you came from God's thighs. Okay, yeah. Okay, that must be sweaty there or smelly or I don't know what, right? And then, and somehow the bullshit continues to then say that, other people did not come from God's head. As a matter of fact, you did not come from anywhere in God's body, then therefore you're outcast. And then the way in which this kind of bullshit circulates globally is just amazing, right? So that's one concern. But the other deeper concern is also that actually people buy this bullshit, right? Pabitra, when you're saying how this person just comes up, holds the mic and talks about how, Dalits and other people on the margins of caste are necessary to maintain the ecosystem, right? This is kind of actually a version of the Gandhian argument, right? That you actually need people to stay in their place for society to function well. That's another kind of bullshit, right? And so I think one of the strengths of the book, Thenmozhi, from my perspective, is that it actually calls out the lie of caste, and that it actually allows us to talk about the ridiculous nature of the bullshit, and to actually to say a hard and conscious no to bullshit. And I think bullshit is bullshit, but there's general bullshit and there's particular bullshit, right? And I think caste is actually the kind of bullshit that's very particular, which means that unless we understand the particular workings of the bullshit of caste, we won't actually be able to understand the wounds of caste and then undertake the work of healing, right? So while on the one hand, healing sounds like this wonderful concept that all of us should, be undertaking, we cannot actually legitimately get on that path without understanding the particulars of the bullshit of caste, right? And they are very, very important particulars, and they're particular, right? They're not general. They're very particular. So thanks for, adding your voice to that conversation. I want to give a nod to the couple of people that you've given a nod to, like Sherry Mitchell, for instance. You start with that on page 8, and you say a wound cannot be healed by pretending that it does not exist, right? So by pretending that caste does not exist, the wounds of caste cannot be healed, right? It's just simply the truth. Now, why is that important? Because, even though Indians are more than 1 billion people, depending on which Indian you talk to, some people will say, caste is not a thing. It's just it's not there. Like maybe somewhere in some remote village in India, but generally speaking, it's a thing of the past. Like people don't operate on the basis of caste. As somebody who grew up in mostly metropolitan, cosmopolitan cities in India, and who is also, I'm a child of like a mixed caste situation. My mother comes from a community called the Naidus in Andhra Pradesh. Telangana is a dominant caste community. My father comes from the Parayar community. And thanks, Thenmozhi, for your glossary of terms. So those of you who don't know that exists, go to the back of the book and read about the Parayar community. And Paraya is a word that is one of the first words to make it to the English dictionary, right? It actually is the name of a Dalit community, Parayars. That's the name of my father's community, right? And the reason I say that is, despite growing up in metropolitan and cosmopolitan cities, I knew how caste operated all around me. Like every day, every day people breathe caste, they speak caste, they act caste with their bodies, right? So the question of body is also very important to me, Thenmozhi. So thanks for helping us to kind of just put that on the table, right? Front and center, that wound cannot be healed by pretending it does not exist. I also want to give a nod to your mother, and I'm glad that you mentioned your mother, Thenmozhi's the fact that your mother is a Dalit Christian, right? I speak also as a Dalit Christian. And what you said about your mother's secret altar of Jesus and Mary in the closet is just so deeply moving to me, right? So Mary is the mother of Jesus, right? And is pregnant with Jesus, right? Mary is pregnant with Jesus. And when an angel actually comes to Mary and says, you're going to give birth to this really really cool person named Jesus. Mary sings a song, right? Mary sings a song, and I want to read a few words of that song and then give a nod to your mother here, Thenmozhi. And I'm on entering minute 8, so I know I'll be done in 2 minutes here. But these are some of the words here that Mary has to say. God has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. God has brought down the mighty from their thrones. God has sent the rich away empty, but has filled the hungry with good things. What a beautiful song that Mary sings, right? And yet when Christian missionaries came to India, they went to those at the top. They didn't go to the hungry. They went to those who had like their bellies full of food, right? And they spoke about Jesus, but those at the top actually had no use for Jesus. Why would they want Jesus as a person who hung out with those on the margins of society, right? The reason I say that is I think your mother recognized the lie of caste because of the songs that she probably had a sense of from her lived experience, perhaps from our Christian heritage. And she's the one who said, right, to you, caste is a lie. That's a wicked lie. Isn't that like your mother's words? It's a wicked lie. And that's exactly what it is. So I feel like your mother probably is one of the first people, like in your generation, in your line of ancestors, right, to call out the lie of caste, to call out the bullshit of caste, and to kind of put you on that path where you think about healing, right? So maybe that's where I should stop, by giving a nod to your mother, by giving a nod to people like Sherry Mitchell, by giving a nod to Mary, by giving a nod to Pabitra here, who spoke about how caste operates, and we feel it in our bodies very deeply. It's very humiliating. And therefore, the task is to heal ourselves from this lie, from this bullshit. So anyway, there's more to say, and but I'm here entering my closing last 10 seconds, so I should stop. Thanks you all. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, John. Would love to pass it over to Mimi for any reflections that you have.
Hi, thanks for having me here. And I'll start with a little bit of land acknowledgement, because I'm usually from New York City, but I'm in Philadelphia for a conference. And Philadelphia stands on the land of the Lenape people, actually as well. New York also does different group, but anyway. So this is a book I was waiting for a very long time. And over the last couple of years, so my usual identity is that I'm a fiction writer. I didn't describe myself. Like I have long hair and tattoo on one arm, and I'm sitting in a hotel room. Anyway, so I largely identify myself as a fiction writer, and so a lot of the things Thenmozhi talks about childhood were also true of me. And like I grew up in Kolkata, so Bengali Dalits once again have like a different kind of history than Dalits from different other different regions of India. A lot of us are extremely assimilated, not completely, but like, you know, distance from our histories and distance from our pasts. And my mother comes from the Namashudra community, which is, I mean, Thenmozhi has mentioned it in the glossary as well, biggest Dalit community among Bengalis. So I was also like, so because my parents had both been scheduled caste students, like quota students in the past. So in my family, we knew that we were scheduled caste. And at one point, when I was a child, maybe 9 or 10 years old, I don't remember exactly where, but I saw the connection. Like I looked up what scheduled caste means. And this is also like before the internet. So like, you don't see a lot of resources, but maybe I saw somewhere. I came and asked my mom, and my mom said, no, we're not untouchables. Like we're scheduled caste, but not untouchables. And I asked, so what does that mean? She said, no, it just means scheduled caste. Like, so I asked, like, so what's like the Bengali equivalent of this word. Like, what is this in society, in like Indian society? She's like, I don't know, it's scheduled caste. We were poor. So, but obviously not all poor people were us, which I already knew. So one of the things that I've struggled with is that, so I learned, I write fiction in English. I grew up, I want to say in the 2000s, 90s and 2000s, and I grew up following the boom of Indian literature in English. So I was following a lot of these authors who came up in the 80s, largely since the 80s, Salman Rushdie, Arundhati Roy, and after that. And I guess my fiction writing in English exists in the tradition of those people. But at one point, I started noticing that that's a different narrative. Like, the post-colonial Indian narrative, since I went to school, university in India, like we talk about how emancipatory the post-colonial narrative is and how it, how it grounds people beyond the white narrative. Like, a few generations before that, English literature mostly used to be about white people. And a lot of writers who started writing were writing white characters. And so we talk about how liberatory the post-colonial narrative is. And like in the science fiction community, that conversation is still happening, that you can like write brown characters. And that's also happening in like TV and cinema and like, Miss Marvel, like you can place a brown character, you can place an Indian character. And that conversation hadn't moved on to then having marginalized Indians among them. And so when I first started writing, I was writing brown characters, writing Indian people. I did not start at the time that I had to start with writing white people. But after a point, I realized that these people are not really exactly from me. Like I was still role-playing when I was writing these characters, but if I didn't want to write them, there wasn't much else for me to write. Like there wasn't really much, I want to say ready-made history, because like, one person can do only so much. Like I did go to university for a while, but I am primarily not a researcher. Like I'm not the person who will be going to the ground and, collecting data. I'm not the person who would like create theology, things like that. Like I would probably take these things as secondary data, make stories out of them, imagine stories out of them. And I felt like this is one of the reasons I've actually, so I wrote some stories. I have not written anything substantial in the last couple of years because I didn't know how to progress. Like I had started writing some Dalit characters, but they were still like very externally viewed, right? Like they were just Dalits by marker in society. But I also wanted to write characters and situations and communities that are steeped in Dalitness. And I didn't know where to start. And then like, this is actually a conversation I had with Thenmozhi in the process when she was writing her book. And we were talking a lot about futurism. And there were like a lot of these conversations about how we fit into the world and how we fit not just in today's world, in the future world, among things like technology, among things like progress, right? Among things like climate change. So there were like a lot of these piecemeal ideas that I mentioned and they came up in our conversation, and like a lot of these piecemeal ideas are put together in a better way in this book. And I'm looking forward to actually use a lot of these lessons in my writing. I also wanted to talk about, so because you have spoken a little about the imaginary and the, dreaming with our ancestors, dreaming of the future, things like that. I have seen some of your fiction writing, and then at some point I would like Thenmozhi to talk about your imagination of the future, because we've like briefly had these conversations, right? And the way the future is a continuation of the past, which already exist in Savarna literature, or like literature from a large number of communities where they do have somewhat of an understanding of the tradition, their ancestors. Like a lot of us don't know our ancestors, like Bengali Dalits, especially, like our history has been whitewashed many times. And like, I am finding some people writing research papers right now on like the background of Bengali Dalits, but like, I haven't found a lot of like ancient history, like I once wanted to do, I'm very interested in doing like one of those DNA tests that tell you your ancestry. Yes, it puts you on a database, but everybody's on a database. And everybody's on a database already. And if any of your relatives does it, you're still on the database. So you don't have to worry about that much. But I just think if I do that, it will just tell me Bengali and Bengali, like what I'm actually interested in is like where my ancestors, parts of Bengal, because Bengal is also a very liminal region, right? So like this Himalayas, the Nepal, Tibet, etc. on the one side, Myanmar on the other side. Bengalis are also actually a fairly mixed race community, which is why a lot of us, like each of us looks a different way sometimes, right? Yeah. So I would have liked to see that history, which I'm still researching, which, like, I mean, these genetic databases will not have the data if the history doesn't exist, because they are picking the history from somewhere else. And a lot of our histories don't exist. So like books like this, put the narrative forward a great deal. And like, thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Thank you so much, everybody, for your responses and for your comments. I would love to open up the floor to any audience questions that you have. Feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will go through them and I will ask the question. We already have one. Great. Somebody says, could you please elaborate further on the similarities and differences between the Black community in the US and the caste system in South Asia? Thenmozhi, do you want to take that one? You're muted.
Sure, absolutely. And so I think that one thing for people to know is that, caste as a system of exclusion is analogous to race, but it's not the same. It's actually an older system of exclusion that has its roots in 2000 BC. And, and as John spoke about, it's based on this social fiction created by people who were in the topmost caste, the priests, the Brahmins, who basically ordered society based on spiritual purity and the jobs they would have and the power that they would have, essentially. And if it sounds a lot like race, it's because race has a similar social fiction, right? Based on white supremacy and the ordering of races for, ease of exploitation. So I think in that regard, there's actually been a lot of ways that Black and Dalit freedom fighters have seen each other across history, and there's many exchanges from, the Dalit leader, Dr. Ambedkar, who had a really amazing correspondence with W.E.B. Du Bois about, what international mechanisms like the forerunner of the UN, the League of Nations, could be used for Black and Dalit freedom. As well as, experiences of the Black and Dalit Panthers, which is another moment of exchange where Dalit organizers took the example of the Black Panthers and started a political and creative platform for Dalit resistance to basically address the amount of caste crimes and the impunity going along with them, to even relationships between Dalit Women Fight and Say Her Name in exchanges that happened in the early 2000s. And so there are ways, big and small, that these movements have seen each other. And a lot of people most recently have come to caste through the work of Isabel Wilkerson, who is a Black scholar and journalist who used the framework of caste to analyze the development of the racial laws around segregation and Jim Crow and our current system of segregation and discrimination in her book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontent. And you can agree with her book or you can disagree with her book. But what it shows is that as oppressed people, we are trying to basically not see each other through the lens of our oppressor, but learn from each other through direct knowledge and connection and meaning. And so whether it's like Pabitra talking about how she saw dominant caste people using caste slurs to refer to Black patrons, we understand that anti-Dalit mindsets turn into anti-Black mindsets when our people come over here. So I think that from a South Asian perspective, a big piece that we're working on is when we center those that are the most marginal in our identity, whether it's caste oppressed people or religious minority people, we actually can pivot the way the South Asian community shows up around many issues, including around racial justice, and so that's a big part of the reasons why I also use the term abolition, because there is a huge battle in the United States to talk about police abolition and ending the carceral system. And I think another big awareness for me in writing this book was how carceral the logics of Brahmanism are, especially the fact that you were born into a Dalit caste because of punishment of something you did in another life. That really stuck with me as a child, especially once I learned I was Dalit. I just really thought, what did I do in another life? Was I a rapist? Was I a murderer? Was I a thief? And I've talked to other Dalits who've had those similar anxieties, because it's a huge mind fuck to be told this. And then to have the logic of your society based on you accepting your conditions of oppression, because if you break it, you're actually breaking your duty towards society and you're breaking your sentence. So you're going to get another lifetime of punishment. So, again, all of this is garbage. It's bullshit, as John talked about. But in order to even get to this point as an individual and as a people to say no, we have to have such fortitude and resilience of spirit and bring all of our stories collectively to defend us, because there at no point are dominant caste people letting their fragility lower enough for us to be human in the face of it. So we have to be so human and fight for that on our own before we can bring them along, because they're certainly not creating the space for us. And that's also why I wrote this book, is to point to them, this is your work too. The burden of addressing the system can't just be on the excluded.
Thank you so much, T. Does anybody have a quick response? If you can do like a few seconds of a response. If not, we can move on to the next question.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, please go ahead, John.
In the North American context, when we're talking about racism, it's not always the case, but most often there are visual cues upon which people operate, right? Now, in the Indian context, we're all brown for the most part, unless you're talking about certain parts of the northeastern parts of India, right? Now, that will be a different situation. For the most part, we're all brown people. So what do you do when brown people are discriminating against other brown people on the basis of caste? This is the challenge, I think, of talking about caste in the Indian context. And part of the reason why I said it's important to talk about the particulars of caste, right? So anyway, that's one thing I'll say.
Thank you so much, John. The next question is, I think anybody can take this question, but what are some books in addition to Thenmozhi's book on caste for a beginner? John, do you want to take a first go at that one? I know you have so many books behind you. You can pull many for examples.
No, well, that's a great question. I'd recommend 3 books, and I'm not shy about recommending my own book, so I'll start with that. Read my book titled Memory, Grief, and Agency, a political theological account of wrongs and rights. Read that book. Read Joshua Samuel's book entitled Untouchable Bodies. And also read Roja Singh's book, Spotted Goddesses. So those are 3 books that you can start off with. And there's plenty more that, footnotes and other things will give you the options to look at from there.
Yeah. Also, if I can make a quick recommendation, also Ants Among Elephants by Sujata Gidla is really good, specifically for a Dalit Christian context in Andhra. Does anybody else want to respond?
I mean, I enjoyed Yashika Dutt's book coming out as a Dalit. So
Any recommendations from you, Thenmozhi?
So many, actually. My entire footnotes is books to read and reports to read. And, you know, I actually have to say that one of the, you know, I love Gail Omvid, actually. She was such a influential writer for me. And there's so many aspects of Dalit religious and political practice that she just has translated. But also I think the writings of Dr. Ambedkar and Jyotibai Phule were very influential for me, as well as Ayodhya Das. And again, all of these links are in the book, so you can just look at the footnotes and find them there. But I also love Debrahmanizing History. That book by Braj Ranjmani Raj was like one of the most influential books on me as well. And I think I read it and then I read it again and then I footnoted it. And it's, you know, there's no question, if he hadn't written that book, I wouldn't have felt as empowered to write this book, as well as Kancha Ilya. He had also had a similar kind of influence on me. And, you know, Pabitra, you know, actually one book, which is actually not a book from us, but actually that really also inspired me, was reading the Mulaki Ain. You know, and folks that may not know the Mulaki Ain, it's actually the first legal code of Nepal. And it's a terrifying document because it's based on the Manusmriti, the first, you know, one of the first Hindu scriptures that established text. But, you know, nowhere else in South Asia is the first legal code of the country based on a Hindu text like that. So when you read it, it has shocking things about caste in it, including the you know, the levels of victims to like sexual violence based on caste. And when I saw that in a document, I was like, oh my God, this struggle is so difficult. And, you know, it may not be as clear for everyone that's listening, but caste is found in all South Asian countries and all religions. And I think, you know, I had to read both, you know, what are the structures of that oppress us, as well as our people's writings that were intended to free us. And to me, the Mulaki Ain, it's a very haunting legal document, you know. And Pabitra, I don't know, did you have books that really helped you? Because I know you were also at Fedo too.
Pabitra mentioned something, I think, in the chat, A Quest for Dignity.
Yeah, A Quest for Dignity. I really like that because in Nepali, like, I'm looking for my dignity. That book, I really like it. For the beginner.
I wanted to mention a book of fiction, like short stories, called Adivasi Will Not Dance, by Hansta Sovendrasekhar. I don't know if there's an American edition, but it's available on Amazon, which, I mean, is endorsing a bad corporation, but I don't know.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's lots of books. Maybe we can gather them together and send them through an email later to the participants. Yes, I just got that question, so we can go ahead and do that. Our last question, unless there are any more, is how can those of us from Brahmin families, particularly second or third generation, who are more distant from South Asia, and that we've never, I lost the question, and that we've never lived there, push back against Brahmin supremacy? So the question is, how can people that have not lived in South Asia push back against Brahmin supremacy?
Well, I think there is actually tons of Brahmin supremacy right here in the United States that you don't have to do any work in South Asia. And you have to keep in mind that a lot of the funding for the political parties that are calcifying and creating casteist dynamics in the subcontinent are getting their funding from their family members and caste networks here. So I think first and foremost, you want to get yourself educated and be connected to other people that are caste abolitionists. And there are many Dalit civil rights organizations, and you can join, like for example, with Equality Labs, you can join our mailing list and keep up to date with news and campaigns that are current in terms of what's going on around the fight for caste equity in the United States. But also you'll find that change is very personal, so outside of like doing your own work, I really recommend that you come to an Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshop and really find out how much of your lineage is dormant with relationship to privilege, and be in community with other people that are working to unlearn it. And then from there, you'll be able to find the places where you can transform. For example, it might be that you join a campaign that's looking to add caste as a protected category in your corporation or your institution. Maybe it's about working with another group of dominant caste people to have de-escalation conversations with uncles and aunties that are behaving in bigoted ways. The problem around caste so far has been, it's been caste suppressed people who have been breaking their bodies and their minds and their spirits, jumping from rooftops, having to do protests and killing themselves literally to say, here is this problem. And the issue is that we cannot end caste by ourselves. And most dominant caste people have been sitting on the sidelines, terrified to enter this conversation because they're worried about what happens when they disrupt the flow of their family networks. But actually, you are best positioned to be that voice of conscience over us, because we're on the outside. And when we speak to your family members, they come after us. There's threats, there's bigotry, there's gaslighting. But, de-escalation happens best when it's from someone that is trusted. So being able to speak as a voice of compassion, but a voice of firmness that this violence cannot continue any longer in your name. And to say, put the sword down of bigotry and rehumanize. Because the thing is that many of these dominant caste networks, the more and more they lean in and fall into polarization and bigotry, the farther and farther they get from other humans and even from a shared consensus of reality. So it's a time that we're going to have to really work to heal these bridges between us, because, when you have such deep polarization, that's when mass atrocity can occur. So we don't have a choice not to engage in this way. Everyone has a role to play to turn us away from this moment of genocide. And it's my hope that you can find that path forward, Yeah,
and I think just to add on, I did learn this from Thenmozhi a couple of years ago, is then where you said you can't police away casteism, you can't police away racism. It's an internal upheaval about how you exist in the world and how you operate when you're walking down the sidewalk and you see a Dalit person. It's a full internal process and work, which is a lot, but I think that's the point that we kind of have to get to. Pabitra, is there anything that you would like to say to that question of how, to the question that Thenmozhi just answered about how folks that are not Dalit can help in dismantling the caste system?
To be honest, we have to be ready, actually. I don't have any answers for that. It's all like, how our society, our family, they prep for our mental, right? And then we run from that from generation to generation, actually. So, and if you really want to see the changes, you are the one who can stand for it, actually, right? I'm not telling you to go and right away you have to, do something, think through, and then, give some time for think about it. Are you really doing good treat for people as a human being for Dalit community? Ask yourself, and then if you feel you can do something, even though you can treat very well, that would be great. You start from something. Yeah. It's so hard like to say, like, you have to do this, you have to do this. This is all from rumor, actually. and generation to generation. I feel like so many times like, oh, this is not me, okay, I'm so good for these things, but this is for my parents. And then again another generation says, oh, this is not me, this is for my parents, from my parents. How many generations we can blame to each other, right? So you are the one who can support for this, and you are the one who will be ready for support these things. And this is nothing. This is just our mental. Caste is our mental. Do we look like different? Do we look like we eat different things? No, we eat same. We look like same. Only the thing is our mental, like be prepared for that. And you don't have to do so many things. Even though if you use like very good word for Dalit community, that would be great. People are scared to use that word as well, so that we are struggling in the United States as well. It's very developed country, but it's so sad to say this kind of word, like people use very bad word for Dalit community. We like to do something else. We didn't like to hear that bad word. Even though if you try to teach these things to other people, that would be great help for us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pabitra. Any final remarks, comments from the panelists before we wrap up?
I just want to thank everyone for speaking their truths and their hearts. It's very rare that we have so many Dalit people speaking from so many different contexts. And, I think for our audience, I think one of the things that is really important is that you're seeing different people in different arcs of their their processing of the violence, and also where people want to go in terms of building the future. And I think in many ways, this is how we become architects. And I can't wait for Mimi's new work. And Mimi was so grateful to graceful and thoughtful in terms of giving me such amazing feedback in this book. And I think this is how Dalit people heal together, as we witness each other in our different phases of coming back to ourselves. And when we give back to each other that witness, we become stronger and fuller, because it's like, yes, this was bad. Like Pabitra, when you shared your story of being afraid to go to school, like I got chills. Like everyone basically went back in time with your younger self and sends you love. No child should be attacked for just going to school, and I think that's why, John's point around it all being bullshit, it absolutely is fucking bullshit. But how we heal from this is, I think, the lesson of what Dalit people will be teaching the world, because we're really not willing to go back in the closet. We don't want to be dehumanized, but how we reclaim ourselves, we want everyone to be in that journey with us of reclamation, because when we do, everything changes, because we were always meant to be together as a species. And there's many stories in nature of collaboration as there is of competition. And that lesson is going to really help us in this time of increased volatility. So I'm just super, super grateful to be here with everyone and for all of our listeners. And Dhanya, for you moderating us. So thank you so much. And thank you, Vandana and AAWW, for holding space for us. It really matters, because Dalit people are blocked in so many contexts. This is how we break those silos and those walls of apartheid. One talk, one relationship, one institution integrating to another at a time. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to the Asian American Writers Workshop. Thank you, Thenmozhi. Thank you, Pabitra, Mimi, and John. And for all of you for joining, I would love to end this with a quote from Thenmozhi's book. I'm going to read the last thing that she said in her book, and it is, "You can be, do, and have everything you could possibly imagine, for dignity is our birthright. As you open your eyes, know that you are loved and the path to freedom is clear." Thank you, everyone, for joining us.